Hello, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. In this episode of Horns, TNSR Editor-in-Chief Will Enboden is joined by two luminaries of American foreign policy, Robert Zoellick, former President of the World Bank, and Philip Zelikow, former Executive Director of the 9/11 Commission and Counselor to numerous administrations. Zoellick and Zelikow discuss Zellick's newest book, America in the World, A History of U.S. Diplomacy and Foreign Policy. In this wide-ranging discussion, they not only cover periods of American diplomatic history that precede the Cold War, which, as Zoellick points out, is important and informative since this was a period of time when America often lacked a preponderance of overwhelming power. They also discuss how it is that Zoellick transformed himself from an economist, an expert in finance, a lawyer, and a diplomat, into a historian who wrote an overarching history of a vast period of American power. Let's listen in on their conversation.
Welcome to our latest episode of Horns of a Dilemma with the Texas National Security Review. This is Will Enboden. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of the Journal and the Executive Director of the Clements Center for National Security. Very honored to have two of America's leading statesmen and historians and foreign policy scholars with us on the show today. We're going to be having a discussion with Bob Zoellick about his captivating new book, America in the World, A History of U.S. Diplomacy and Foreign Policy, just published a couple of weeks ago. Leading the discussion with Bob is going to be Philip Zelikow, an accomplished author, most recently published, along with Condoleezza Rice, To Build a Better World. Interestingly, both Philip and Bob's books are published by 12, a fantastic publisher and a very, very, very prestigious one. So, Philip, how about we turn it over to you to tee up some questions for Bob, and we will dive into the book here.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Will, and it's a pleasure to have a chance to talk about Bob Zoellick's book, America in the World. Bob, here you are. You're a very prestigious former official, a former president of the World Bank. You've done all this stuff as a practitioner. And then, as you explain in opening up the book, you kind of try to think back on the question, which I'll summarize as this. Is there an American diplomatic tradition? Is there some special style or character to the way Americans practice foreign policy over their history? And at the very beginning, you make an argument that says a stock view was just simply to transplant European ideas about foreign policy and see if they stuck in America. Then there were people who criticized America's moralism and legalism, or America's foreign policy as a search for markets and capitalism. But what you're effectively trying to do in this book, as I grasped it, is you got motivated by the idea that there actually is a distinctive American foreign policy tradition, and no one has ever adequately described it. Is that a fair summary of your mission?
What I tried to do with this book, Phil, was add the ideas and experience from American diplomacy as I read it into history, and try to approach it through a series of stories about people and episodes and practice, so as to offer the rich menu of ideas about U.S. foreign policy that I think is available over a course of 200 plus years. And in particular, I think insofar as the field of diplomatic history still taught, it tends to focus on the post-World War II and the Cold War period, and perhaps the years that followed. And I think there's a rich set of experiences from the first 150 years of a U.S. diplomatic history. And that's also important because in much of that time, the United States didn't have overwhelming power. And I think that actually offers important insights on the nature of how to try to conduct diplomacy today. And I suppose one other thought is, as you would know, as a true scholar of this field, as does Will, that diplomatic history in some ways is fated as a field for the understandable reason that scholars have wanted to work in more actors, different perspectives. But I think it's led to a certain fragmentation of the field. And this is an effort to redraw some synthesis and, in the words of Fred Logevall, sort of return to the challenge of writing political history.
Most people who would have known about you before this book came out would have said, oh, he's an expert in international finance, he's an expert in diplomacy, he's worked with international institutions, he's an expert on trade, he's a good lawyer, he knows about politics. No one would ever have probably said, he's an accomplished historian. Indeed, so accomplished that he should now embark on trying to summarize the whole history of American foreign policy. Now, I understand that you've actually been a closet historian all along, and we're just waiting for the chance to burst out. But can you describe a little bit the challenge of reinventing yourself as a magisterial historian?
I first started to take courses in diplomatic history in the 1970s, so I guess that gives me some experience. But it's always affected how I've thought about policymaking. So when it came time to work on this book, I clearly relied on the work of many serious scholars over generations. And Phil, in particular, helped me identify some that I hadn't kept up with. But I also did look at a number of the primary source materials. And for those interested in the scholarship, I tried to put the notes together so they would be a useful compendium and in some ways summary of a lot of the work that covered in each of these chapters. But I saw my task as trying to take that material and use the art of storytelling accurately with selective choices to try to focus on particular people and events, and also add my assessments of not only their diplomacy, but also the practice of diplomacy. I mean, just to give you a practical feel, the introduction opens with Ben Franklin. There's some good stories there, but underneath the stories, consider the issues that it presents. The challenge of moving from war to negotiating peace, and even in the case of Franklin, seeking reconciliation with Britain at the same time, a good relationship with France. How he does this with a pretty weak hand, at least as compared to much of U.S. history that follows. He has to negotiate with his own delegation. He's got a multiple party negotiation. He has to deal with allies in Congress, and in fact, the ally, in this case France, has directed the Congress to direct the negotiators to only agree if France agrees. And the key negotiating team eventually abandons that position, and then Franklin has to explain it as well as ask for a new loan. As a diplomat, one aspect I draw it for him, and I've tried to draw it for others, is he has the skill of keeping his eye on the primary objective. Negotiators sometimes get drawn off in peripheral issues. Franklin doesn't do that. He has a great sense of timing. He knows how to use espionage. And one observation that he makes, that Hamilton also makes, that I've found and hope people will recognize, is that even small gestures can have great influence on important people and events. So if one reflects on that experience that Franklin has, I think there's a lot that one can draw to apply to future periods as well as to today.
I was in reflecting a little bit about the whole approach you took to this book. There's something about this approach that is really distinctively yours in the whole method you applied to these stories. And I want to use some of your own words from early in the book to summarize this approach and get you to talk about it. You say that the standard intellectual histories of American foreign policies are stimulating and creative, but you say they, quote, risk squeezing messy facts and complex causes to fit theoretical structures. They oversimplify and often fail to explain what, in fact, happened. Then you go on to say, explaining that your approach is pragmatic, that rather than try to offer simple formulas for success or actually an overarching thesis, quote, I will describe the reality of how most U.S. officials approached diplomatic problems, close quote. And it seemed to me that that sentence captures a whole historical method that you use all through the book, including through your personalities. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that choice?
Well, that is the heart of what the book is about. And probably like others who would listen to this podcast, I've been intrigued by some of the intellectual frameworks, whether it's realism, idealism, or many, many other structures that people have used. But as I've reflected on my own personal experience, and as I read into the history, I'm not sure it gives much of a guidance on what to do in 1989 as you face the challenge of Germany and the end of the Cold War, or how to approach a trade negotiating strategy. So what I have experienced, and if you think about it today, if you think about people talking about foreign policy, rise of China, what to do with Iran or North Korea, they don't get too far with abstract discussions of offshore balancing or different types of realism. They have to dig into the reality of the problem. And sometimes the summaries that one sees that scholars develop, I imagine, for the sake of a thesis, don't necessarily cover fully some of the complexities of what people were trying to deal with on the ground. So part of my challenge here was to look back at the facts, make sure that I explain them, but then tried to give a sense of how I saw people trying to address the problems of their era. Now, as part of that, I draw out this notion of pragmatism. And by this, what I mean is that if one takes too much of an intellectual framework approach, you run the risk of having the abstractions or timeless truths kind of force you into a model. And the pragmatic experience basically starts with problems, thinks about means to ends, recognizes chance and contingency, and kind of emphasizes results over theories. And I think a lot of decision makers with varying degrees of skill have tried to deal with this challenge of what actually works. Now, they often start with the realities on the ground, whether it's power, economics, military capacity, technology, votes. They have to have a sense of processes and institutions, how they work, how do you get things done. They have to understand the positions of others and their interests. They have to have this sense of timing, as I mentioned with the Franklin story. And perhaps they also recognize that most people making policy have to deal with imperfect results in a far from perfect world. So in that sense, perhaps they look upon history as offering insights on how to do better, not just acceptance of timeless obstacles.
So if I may summarize this, it sounds to me like your argument is that the grand theories, A, don't explain what happened in the past, and B, don't provide any useful guide as to how to solve problems in the future.
Well, my pragmatic nature, Phil, wouldn't draw an extreme conclusion, but I think there are limits to the grand frameworks of the past, and I try to draw those out in particular cases and let people make their own judgments.
On the other hand, the argument against your approach would be, well, then all this just becomes a litter of stories, and each story is idiosyncratic, and they don't really cohere to really give us any sense of continuities or themes. But your answer to that is actually that you do see some running themes. The way you summarize it in the book are, quote, traditions that you see recurring in American foreign policy over the years that help make up the true American foreign policy tradition. And you isolate 5 key traditions that seem to stand out to you. Could you quickly just introduce what you think those 5 traditions are?
Sure. So the first is the importance of North America, which is interesting because if you ask most foreign policy experts today to give you their recommendations for the future foreign policy, they would usually overlook North America. Obviously, in the 19th century, this was critically important as the country was expanding continentally, trying to deal with its neighbors, ward off foreign intervention. In the 20th century, we almost had a second war with Mexico. They had the case of the Zimmerman telegram in 1917, where the Germans suggested to the Mexicans that they could regain Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona if they went to war with the United States. For some reason, they left off California. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, which you've written about, the one sort of nuclear showdown occurs in the Caribbean. NAFTA, which was a way of trying to reformulate the relations with a changing Mexico. But I would argue even today, if you ask many Americans what they're most interested in, they'll focus on topics such as immigration, economic relations with their neighbors, including Mexico and Canada, organized crime and narcotics, problems of Central America, environmental issues. And so the so-called foreign policy topics often draw us right back to North America. And I also see, however, a launching pad. I think for America's role in the world, we will be much stronger if we recognize the continental base of the United States and its North American neighbors, whether economically, politically, in security terms. And I was struck that Ronald Reagan, when he launched his campaign in 1979, makes the point that the United States would be better off if Canada and Mexico are stronger, not weaker, and that indeed we should stop seeing our nearest neighbors as foreigners. And just imagine that today. So that's the first. And then the second was trade and transnational and technology ties. And here I hearken back to the American experience from 1776 on, where they look upon trade as more than economic efficiency. It's a way of opening doors for private actors in the world. And this community of private actors moves beyond the economic relationships. But it's also a way of expanding openness and liberty. Now, we have good and bad experiences this, including the disaster of the 1930 Smoot-Hawley Bill and the breakdown of the international system. The third one is alliances. And here, what I am focusing on is after the cautions of Washington and Jefferson about no permanent and then no entangling alliances, for 150 years, American leaders have to figure out how do we engage with the world without except using alliances. And so much of the history that I try to talk about, whether it's the economic ties, whether it's international law ties, whether it's arms control with regional stability, whether it's the notion, the drawing from the experience of the American Union after the Civil War with sort of confederal relations. Many of these are ways of engaging with others around the world without having alliances. But then the 1947-49 burst of activity creates a new type of alliance system. And I seek to distinguish the type of system the United States creates from the one that it had in mind avoiding with the old European experience of alliances in an earlier period. And then for the next 70 years, we test the borders of that system. Does it mean the defense of Berlin? Does it mean fighting in Vietnam? It produces the successful result under President Bush 41 for the end of the Cold War in Europe. And then the question is, what happens to that system afterwards? And I think that's a very real life question today. And then the fourth one is often overlooked by foreign policy specialists, which is to have a successful statecraft, you need to have support of the Congress and the American public. So I try to weave some of that in, whether it's how Thomas Jefferson used the congressional sort of interest in Louisiana. I focus on Vandenberg in 47-49 to sort of see the congressional role, but it appears through a number of the different accounts. And then the last is the notion of America's purpose. In here, I avoided the use of the word exceptionalism because I didn't want to try to compare the U.S. Experience with the rest of the world as much as I wanted to focus on how Americans have, from the very start, perceived that they were creating a novus ordo seclorum, a new order of the ages. And at the start, that was just the notion of how do we keep a republic alive in the midst of an imperial world of mercantilism and empires. Then it moves on to how to preserve a union. Then it moves on to, under Teddy Roosevelt, sort of a balance and the use of mediation to stop a global conflagration that eventually breaks out in World War I. For Woodrow Wilson, it's the question of how do you make the world safe for democracy, not necessarily how you create democracy. And then people are well aware of the notion of the U.S. in the Cold War as the leader of the free world, different notions of enlargement. So I think this is part of the American impulse, and the question is, what role will it have going forward?
To be sure, to summarize it, you actually do find that there are really quite 5 distinct characteristics of the American foreign policy tradition. There's this distinctive attachment to the North American base. There's a distinctive interest in trade, transnational contacts, and technology as a way of engaging the world. There's a commitment to alliances. There's a distinctive commitment to public and congressional support as an aspect of foreign policy. And last, you say that there is a constant sense of distinctive American purpose, though you don't think it's the American exceptionalism that is alternately praised or mocked by some. And then you try to show how those traditions play out through the stories of these individuals and the particular problems that they solve in the book. And in the book itself, you pick out some unusual individuals to focus on. I think people that a lot of Americans haven't heard much about. And to give as an example, you devote a whole chapter to a man named Elihu Root, and another whole chapter right after that to a man named Charles Evans Hughes. Could you say a little bit more about why Americans ought to know who Root and Hughes were?
Well, first off, they are wonderfully interesting people. Root was Secretary of War, Secretary of State, Senator from New York. And in the context of this book, I emphasize him as a leader of the Venerable Vex tradition of international law. And one reason I wanted to do that is that in more recent experience, people sometimes poo-poo international law. But I wanted people to understand these were practical men. These were not utopian men. And in the context of their time, they're trying to come up with a role for America in the world that does not involve alliances, because until 47, 49, those are taboo, doesn't involve the League of Nations after the failure, but also doesn't involve an isolationist tradition. And in the case of Root, I go back to the American historical experience, starting with the Declaration of Independence, which is in many ways is a legal indictment of the British, and it's stated as trying to make the case to the world. But then there's early efforts at arbitration in the Jay Treaty of 1795. There's a movement in an earlier period for Americans, just as they saw the legal tradition in the United States to evolve, how it might also occur internationally. I think it was in 1817 we have our first arms control agreement with Britain dealing with the Canadian border, and starting what becomes a very important security arrangement for the United States on its northern border. But there's always a challenge, which is if you want to move towards particular legal arrangements like arbitration or international courts, the Senate has a role, and to understand how the Senate sort of constrains this development. In the case of Root, he's brought in as a Secretary of War and is quite an important modernizer. In fact, if people go to National Defense University today, they'll see a plaque because he helped create the National War College system. But McKinley brings him in first because he needs a lawyer to develop a colonial policy for Cuba and the Philippines. And I explain how the American development of that was different from other countries and why it looked to the legal tradition. And then he becomes a key figure as Woodrow Wilson is struggling with his Paris Treaty in offering a route out to reservations, which Wilson does not accept. Now, some of this may seem distant, but I wanted readers to think about that when they hear the term rules-based systems, or in the political science term, the notion of regimes, that this traces back to this tradition of Root. And indeed, I close with a seminar that I discovered in 2006 that has three scholars debating this tradition 100 years after the International Law Society was created. And one says, well, international law can only work under democracies. Another suggests, and that's Anne-Marie Slaughter, who is a well-known international lawyer and practitioner, and professor for many years at Princeton. Another says international law is a constraint on democracies. And the third says the problem with international law thinking is it assumes a stability of the system. So he's bringing in what lawyers would know as sort of a legal realism. So in the process of telling the story of Root, I'm also trying to help people understand how these concepts are still persisting in today's debate. Now, you ask about Charles Evans Hughes. Charles Evans Hughes was governor of New York, a Supreme Court justice, almost wins the 1916 election against Woodrow Wilson, but fails in California by about 3,800 votes. He's appointed Secretary of State by Warren Harding in 1920, 1921, and he comes in with a very difficult hand to play because, recall, Wilson has just failed to get his treaty in the League of Nations through the Senate. One of the senators of Hughes' own party says it doesn't matter who's Secretary of State because the Senate's going to run the whole situation. So again, the question is, how will America engage in its interests without alliances, without the League, sort of avoiding isolation? And Hughes' answer is to combine arms control with regional security. And I think it had interesting results then, but I would also suggest it might have some lessons for today. In talking about arms control, I emphasize one needs to view it as a process, not as a one-off event. And one needs to continue to reassess and reinforce and redirect it. But Hughes comes in a situation where the Senate wants to control everything. The American public is very disappointed in the aftermath of World War I. There is a movement to limit naval arms. There's a movement to limit the budget for the Navy. There's international interest in this topic that Hughes assesses, and he's got some unresolved regional security issues in East Asia. So part of this story for him is his skill at creating his own momentum and sort of negotiating process. But I also retrieved something that your friend and former colleague Ernest May identified that I thought was quite interesting. It's been sort of lost in this period, which is that the agreement that he struck at the Washington Conference of 1921-1922 was part of a series of regional accords of this period. There was one with the Poles and the Soviets. There was the Lausanne Accord that dealt with the remains of the Ottoman Empire, which again we're seeing come back today, Locarno for Eastern Europe. And you had these somewhat fragile interlocking arrangements that depended fundamentally on the role the U.S. would play in the international economy. And we saw how that turned out. Now, I think many people would look upon the Charles Evans Hughes and the Washington Conference as sort of the bad example of you can't trust arms control because it leads to World War II. I think that's a mistake, and it overlooks in our period, Phil, when Bush 41 wanted to focus on the heart of Europe and Germany in 1989, he uses the Conventional Forces Agreement to shift policy, the priority from just the nuclear arms to the conventional forces in Europe. So what I try to do with these accounts is put them out there in interesting forms for people to enjoy the history, but also to plant sort of seeds of insight that might be used going forward today. And just to give you another specific example, I don't think the U.S. can deal effectively with, say, North Korea's nuclear arms or Iran's nuclear arms without putting it in the context of regional security. And you could even argue that what's happened over the past sort of weeks here with the UAE and Israel is an example of how you have to look upon Iran as part of a regional security arrangement if you're going to deal with its nuclear weapons through other devices.
One of the striking things about the Hughes regional efforts that you just mentioned is that Hughes and the United States are really trying to shelter China's political development. It's not a perfect shield, but they're fundamentally trying to let China go through the throes of turmoil and after the fall of the Qing Empire and see something else emerge from China that is distinctively Chinese. And this fundamentally conditions a whole attitude of America that we're interested in China's future. We want to protect China's future from foreign domination so that eventually, 10 years later, when the Japanese make their moves in China, America is fundamentally conditioned to be hostile to that from the get-go, which turns out to be pretty fateful. So in a way, in this period where most people think America has separated itself from the world, Hughes is leading the United States to take actually a very engaged and protective attitude towards the development of China, which is the country that most people nowadays think is our longtime enemy.
Well, there's those elements, but I would even go further. The agreement first starts to recognize that you can create a security that still relies on a balance, but at a lower level. And in this case, the Congress was not going to pay for more. The relationship with Britain is quite important at this point. We assume the special relationship with Britain, but at this time, Britain had a treaty with Japan, which makes the United States quite anxious. That's part of the politics that Hughes manages of this. The U.S. manages to end that treaty. It also starts to build relationships with Australia and Canada that become important going forward. There's an opportunity with Japan that I think people often overlooked. There's a movement in the 1920s among some of the Japanese leaders to rely not just on military power, but the economic role of Japan in the world. And obviously this becomes part of the Japanese strategy after World War II. It ends for various reasons. One is their competition with China over Manchuria. Certainly the Great Depression has a role. As you mentioned, not only is it sort of trying to develop a developmental policy for China, but with the U.S. public, Japan at this time had still been occupying the Shantung Peninsula, which had been a German colony, and held land and railroad lines in the northern part of China. So the United States manages to end those. So, in some ways, I would look upon this agreement as a bridge that in some ways kind of helps pick up on common ground, but also while there's other conflicts that still have to be managed. And I think that's a historical insight too. If people feel that diplomatic accomplishments have to create perpetual peace, it's going to be a rather short list of pluses. But if one also sort of sees that each of these events leads to another set of questions. So another dimension of this that I try to highlight is the changes in technology. So because battleships are what are the subject of the negotiations, you see some of the power move to aircraft carriers and submarines. Through Michael Green's work, I found this sort of wonderful example that Chester Nimitz, who's becomes the commander in the Pacific in World War II, does his War College thesis in the early 20s about how the United States will project power in the Western Pacific without access to bases that were precluded by this agreement. The Marines start to develop expeditionary capacities. So it makes the point about arms control as part of a process of security as opposed to just a technical treaty.
That's really helpful. So let's actually stay in that spirit, because a lot of people wonder about what is the future of American alliances and international commitments today. And in a way, you're giving a portrait and say, here's the problem people like Charles Evans Hughes faces at the beginning of the 1920s, how to stay engaged without formal alliances. And he comes up with these very interesting, creative answers that address some of the problems at the beginning of the 1920s. Then here we are in the late 1940s. We're building a new alliance system in the aftermath of World War II, addressing those problems. Then in your book, you also talk about the way all these alliance structures are adapted and overhauled at the time the Cold War ends in order to set up the new global system that goes into place at the beginning of the 1990s. But that step forward, here we are in yet another period of great change. As you put it in your book near the end, the United States remains at the heart of the alliance and economic networks it created. Those alliances and networks are wearing thin, close quote. So talk a little bit then about the problems faced now if you want to adapt this historic commitment to using alliances, but now to the situations and problems of the early 21st century.
Well, there are a number of dimensions to it. The starting point would be to recognize what are the challenges that the United States and its allies face in this era that are different from, say, the Soviet Union as a challenge in 1947. And this is an area you've done some work on, Phil. So obviously questions of biological security. We're dealing with a pandemic, but I was on a call with one of the world's leading virologists not long ago, and he said, we get about 5 of these viruses a year that could explode on us, and a number of them are sort of wildlife related. The issues of inclusive economic growth and to get out of this hole, but to move forward as well, to bring in the developing world effectively, environmental and climate and energy policies, issues of cybersecurity, but also data opportunity. All those would be a good agenda to approach our allies with to sort of rebuild and modernize these partnerships. But again, this is a point you've made, is that to then think about with these partners, what's the future? Are we going to deal with China? So you could imagine that as opposed to just looking about kind of how we overcome some of the frictions from the Trump approach to alliances, you could change this into a constructive agenda. Now, in the process, and this is what I partly do in the chapters about the Cold War, you need a special style of alliance management. So I highlight President Bush 41 is in some ways the exemplar of this. But you also have the question of how far are you going to extend your security umbrella? Would it be Berlin as it was in 47, 49? Would it be Vietnam? So these are questions that I don't think you can discuss in the abstract, and it's part of my point about the nature of problem solving, but it helps to have a framework about how America engages in the world most effectively as you think about them.
But if I understand your framework, you're not saying that the answer, say, to Trump is to try to roll the clock back to the good old days of the early 1990s. I think I hear you saying that the message of your book is that we actually need to keep this theme in mind of using these engagements and partnerships, but that we need to transform and adapt these partnerships as past Americans have done in a pragmatic and creative way.
That's correct.
So another figure that you bring out in your book that I think a lot of Americans would never think of in a book about our foreign policy traditions is a man named Vannevar Bush, who was unrelated to either George H.W. Bush or George W. Bush. Vannevar Bush from New England. Talk a little bit about why Americans should have ever heard of Vannevar Bush and connect him with our foreign policy, and why he's relevant now.
Well, I included Vannevar Bush in that chapter because I see him as the godfather of an American diplomacy that continues to leverage perpetual change in science and technology. So many foreign policy studies look at geopolitics, and now there's an increasing attention to so-called geoeconomics. Vannevar Bush was my way of inserting science and technology into an understanding of what happened, and my belief will be quite important in the years and decades ahead. And this is where history gives you some wonderful cards to play. I start this chapter in July 1945. In 1 month, there's 3 events that illustrate what I've just said. Bush is in New Mexico at the atomic bomb test in July of 1945, and he is served as the principal liaison with President Roosevelt. And indeed, Roosevelt looks to him to sort of start the Manhattan Project. Second, he produces a study that he shrewdly asked Roosevelt to ask him to look at, which is to try to design future American science policy based on Bush's role in World War II. And so he comes up with a report called Science, the Endless Frontier. So again, we tend to think about frontiers in geographic terms. He's now adding science as a dimension. And he basically comes up with a model of governmental basic science research connected to universities, connected to the private sector. At Stanford, this is called the triple helix system. And I would argue is a key to America's success in the Cold War period in competition with the Soviet Union. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But then the third example of July of 45 is just amazing. Bush writes an article in the Atlantic Monthly where he imagines what he calls a Memex machine. And as you see the description, he's basically describing the idea of a personal computer to liberate individuals to have this information on a desktop machine with links. Now, remember, this is an age where we're just starting to move towards huge computers, and he's imagining personalized computer systems. And it turns out that a radar technician who's going off to the Philippines discovers a reprint of this article in a Red Cross library on stilts in Leyte, and decides to go back and become a computer scientist and is one of the fathers of the PC system. And indeed, one of Vannevar Bush's students becomes a provost at Stanford and developed Silicon Valley. So you have these three wonderful connections about science and technology. Now, clearly for Bush was this idea of how can you have a system of liberty and a place for mavericks who will also spark progress in a public policy system? And this is, I think, going to be a question for our issues with China, as well as they were with the Soviet Union in the Cold War. And I take it one step further. The questions he raises, whether it's public policy and nuclear weapons or other scientific topics, is so relevant today if you think about policy and pandemics or climate change. And I draw in a little bit of experience that I had with negotiating the 1992 Framework Accord for climate change, which many people are unaware of is the basis for the Paris Accord and frankly all that will follow. And making the political point, it's the only one that the Senate has ever ratified. So Bush, I wanted to make sure I include something on science and technology, and Bush was a gift to be able to develop that.
No, and you really are advocating that rather than think of America's scientific prowess as something that's in some other issue category that they study in engineering schools. You really want to double down on that as an aspect of our foreign policy tradition. And
also the diplomatic method. So what I touch on a little bit, and this is the point throughout the book, I'm also trying to help, whether it be future foreign service officers or statespeople to kind of have a sense of the practice of diplomacy. You design, if you have policies and even international agreements dealing with science, I think you need to design them a little differently.
So I want to bring Will Inbitten back into the conversation because I think there's an aspect of your book that he wants to press on.
Yeah, Bob, one of the things I most love about history is its endless capacity to surprise. You know, we may think we know or have a certain impression of a historical figure episode, but then when you dig more deeply, you may find, a very, very different assessment. I'm just curious, over the course of researching and writing this book, is there any particular figure or episode that you changed your assessment of? You may have thought one thing going into it, and then after you probed more deeply, you came out with a different assessment. You've already mentioned some wonderfully surprising people like Root and Hughes and Bush just now, but were there any where you found yourself changing your mind?
Well, since I had read a lot of history and I had to design the book based on a wide scope of reading, I had a structure. But as you say, Will, there were insights you would draw. So let me give you a couple of examples. Number one, I was fascinated by Lincoln and Seward and their foreign policy. There's lots of books about battles and generals and societal consequences and Civil War and slavery. Very few about the foreign policy of the United States. And yet, if you think about it, if there had been an intervention by Britain and France, and there nearly was, how that would have changed the course of history. And it starts with the challenge that Lincoln and Seward had because their predecessors in the Buchanan administration and almost accepted secession as a fait accompli. And that's how the rest of the world viewed it. So they had to create a sense of threat to raise the cost of accepting or the Confederacy, but not go over the line. So how they managed sort of brinksmanship in the process. They also created, it's a wonderful example of what today people would call humanitarian intervention, where in 1862, there was an effort by Britain to start to consider, how do we stop this bloodletting? And this one had a wonderful origin. The idea first came to me from Sir Michael Howard, the great British historian, at a seminar that I organized in the mid-90s. And he was cautioning about sort of sometimes with humanitarian intervention, you have a good intention, but you have to let events take their course. And then there's a wonderful example there about the Emancipation Proclamation in building a British American public opinion. I was surprised to discover that at first London reacted quite hostily to it, but here's the context. In their terms, they're thinking about the Indian Mutiny of 1857, and so the idea of encouraging a native insurrection or servile insurrection doesn't cut too much mustard. But Lincoln and Seward brilliantly, frankly, used public diplomacy, the letter to the laborers of Manchester, standing up for freedom. They pay speakers in Britain. So there's a wonderful story about the international dimensions and also one about how Seward manages the French intervention in Mexico. I talk about Vandenberg because in each of these chapters, I didn't want to just spend time on well-trodden ground. And I wanted in the alliance story to come back to the critical role of members of Congress, and particularly senators, which you saw later with people like John McCain or Senators Lugar and Nunn, I think will be important in the future. There's some wonderful descriptions of his methods that would be useful for people. I suppose another one was...
You're talking about Vandenberg's methods?
Yes, Senator Vandenberg's methods. So there's a wonderful little anecdote from Dean Acheson's memoirs where he refers to political transubstantiation. So this draws from the communion concept in Christianity of turning the bread and the wine into the body and blood of Christ. But the political transubstantiation is that Vandenberg starts out being skeptical about a proposal. Then he finds one element, in Acheson's view, often not a critical one, but pounces on it and says, this has to be fixed. He uses that to put together a solution, invariably the Vandenberg Amendment, that brings along his colleagues. And in the process, he builds public support. And how he, for example, even before the NATO negotiations in 1948, he writes himself a 6-paragraph resolution. And he spends days discussing it with his committee behind closed doors. And in Acheson's words, not only gave consent, but gave good advice for the alliance creation. So understanding this congressional dimension is important. On LBJ, obviously, having lived through the Vietnam War, I've always been struck by the tragedy of it. I always had approached it somewhat sympathetically to Johnson's difficult position. As I probed, I tried to look at this chapter with kind of 6 sort of issues about what went wrong. And I'm afraid I ended up being increasingly disappointed with how Johnson treated Vietnam principally as a question of domestic politics. And I think he was badly failed by his advisors as well. And the last one, which Will, given your work on the biography, is I was part of the Reagan administration in the second term, but I always wondered what exactly was the formula for Reagan's success? How did this work? And I used his speech at Westminster to focus on how Reagan used speeches and oratory to refine his thinking, which he had been doing since his days of writing radio scripts or speaking for GE, how it gave him an appreciation and a focus and a conviction that it's hard for many historians to understand how that drew his policy, but it also had to be connected with his love of negotiations. And George Shultz brings him into the negotiating process with the Soviets in the second term quite effectively. Now, there's a weakness to Reagan's style, which is that he tends not to focus on the details or what I refer to as the operational art. So it's very important to see who his key relationships are. And I think Shultz plays this role for him with foreign policy. Baker plays this role as chief of staff in the first term and as Secretary of Treasury in the second term. And I guess one other insight that I would draw from across these stories, and it's even come up in my comment here about LBJ and Reagan, is seeing a presidency in the team, seeing how the people fit together. This is certainly part of the story of Bush 41. This is, I think, it's sort of recognized, but how they actually work together is not always as fully appreciated by historians who maybe not have the sense of how some of these policies are effectively made at the top level.
Well, the team for this particular podcast is captained by Will Inboden. And Will, I'm going to turn back to you to give you a chance to wrap this up.
Thank you, Philip and Bob. And I feel like we could go on for many more hours here because there's so much rich material in the book. But let me just close with an admonition to our listeners. Please buy the book, again, by Bob Zoellick, America in the World, available at Amazon and many other fine booksellers. But then I do want to give the last word to Bob and or Philip. If either of you have any closing comments here, we've covered so much, but any final points you want to make sure that our listeners get before we wrap up?
I guess I would add with these thoughts. And this is a topic that Phil and Will and I have all discussed. There's a tendency in learning from history to draw analogies. And it's a natural process. We all do it. But I caution, as did Ernest May and Richard Neustadt in their book about thinking in time, analogies can often be misleading. So I like to look at history as a way of asking questions, trying to understand the context for a problem, trying to understand how people have approached it before, trying to understand your other counterparties. So if you think about another theme I have in the book of sort of pragmatism, it often draws from having a sense of history, but to think of questions as opposed to sort of formulas that you can plug in. So at the end of the day, a lot of my interest in this book was part of my own love of history, but partly to share with people some ideas beyond the tradition, some experiences, some people, add my own assessments, add my own sense of kind of how diplomacy works in practice. But then I hope for younger generations to give people a sense of how they can draw on history in thinking about stream of events and events today and in the future.
Fantastic, Bob. And I hope that'll be certainly one of the many uses of your book is for future grad students to find new dissertation topics to go deeper on some of these themes, but also young and aspiring policymakers to use this as a much better manual on how to apply historical consciousness and sensibility to policymaking beyond just the cheap analogies.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. And please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.